Next morning, fleet of SUVs arrived at her house. The sky was screaming. Flames clawed their way up from the sinking jet, swallowing metal and smoke as waves crashed against burning debris. She didn't think, she ran. Cold water bit into her legs as she dove beneath the surface, the weight of panic crushing her lungs. Through the blur of bubbles and blood, she saw him, a man trapped inside, motionless, his body pressed against the window. The jet was going down fast. She kicked harder, ignoring the sting in her chest, grabbed his arm, and yanked with everything she had. The metal frame sliced her forearm open, blood mixing with seawater, but she didn't let go. The man's head slumped forward, his lips blue, his shirt torn and soaked in red. She screamed underwater, bubbles bursting from her mouth as she dragged him free. When they surfaced, the explosion hit. A blast of fire roared behind them, lighting up the horizon like a second sun. She coughed and gasped, trying to keep his head above water, the smell of fuel choking her throat. Her arms trembled, but she refused to stop. She pulled him closer to shore, every wave throwing them back, her strength fading fast. She didn't know who he was, didn't care. All she saw was someone dying, and she couldn't let that happen. When they finally hit the sand, she collapsed beside him. His face was pale, his pulse weak. She pressed her ear to his chest. Nothing, no heartbeat. Her shaking hands slammed against his chest again and again, begging him to breathe. Come on, don't die on me. A cough tore out of him, water spilling from his mouth. He was alive. She rolled on her back, chest heaving, the sound of fire and sirens blending with her heartbeat. If you're watching this right now, tell us where you're tuning in from. What time is it in your city? Don't forget to hit. This one's about to explode. You won't believe what happens next. The man she just saved wasn't ordinary. He was the kind of man people whispered about in fear, the kind whose name could silence a room. But she didn't know that yet. She only knew the taste of salt and smoke in her mouth, the sight of his hand twitching against hers. His eyes open, dark, cold, and sharp even through the pain. He looked at her like he couldn't decide whether to thank her or kill her. Then his eyes rolled back, and he passed out again. She stayed by his side until the rescue boats arrived. Medics rushed him away while she sat wrapped in a blanket, still trembling, her wet hair plastered to her face. She watched as they loaded him into an ambulance, guards in suits surrounding him like shadows. Who travels with armed guards on a private jet? She thought. Who was this man she just pulled out of death? Hours later, she sat in a sterile hospital hallway, staring at her blood-stained hands. Her name was Elise. She worked part-time as a swim instructor, the kind of person who always helped others before herself. But tonight had broken something inside her. Every sound made her flinch. The distant sirens, the click of boots down the corridor, the whispering of men in suits who kept glancing at her. One of them approached, a tall man with a scar down his neck and eyes that didn't blink enough. He asked how she found him, how long he'd been under what she'd seen. His voice was polite, but there was something in it that made her spine lock tight. When she told him she just wanted to make sure the man survived, the scarred man smiled. Not kindly. He handed her a phone number, told her she'd be contacted soon, and disappeared down the hallway. She didn't sleep that night. Her body ached, but her mind refused to stop replaying the explosion, the man's cold stare, the fire that nearly swallowed them both. She turned on the news. The crash was everywhere. Headlines called it an accident, mechanical failure, no mention of names. But then she caught something in the background footage. Men in black suits moving fast, faces hidden. Not ordinary passengers. Not ordinary people. Morning came like a punishment. Elise stood by her small apartment window, watching the rain streak down the glass, trying to convince herself it was over. She'd done her part. Save a life. Nothing more. But deep down, she knew things weren't that simple. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. The voice was low, rough, familiar. He was awake. The man she'd dragged from the ocean. He said her name like he'd known it all his life. Said he wanted to see her. That she shouldn't say no. The line went dead. Her stomach twisted. She didn't even remember telling anyone her name. But she couldn't shake his voice. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Something told her walking away wasn't an option anymore. She tried to calm her shaking hands, tried to convince herself it was gratitude, that he just wanted to thank her. But another part of her whispered the truth. Men like him didn't say thank you. They said nothing, or they said goodbye. 2 hours later, she was still pacing her apartment when the sound of engines shattered the silence. She looked out the window and froze. A fleet of black SUVs lined the street, engines humming like predators waiting to strike. Men stepped out, suits sharp, eyes hidden behind tinted glasses. They surrounded her building, their movements too coordinated to be police. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She backed away from the window, her mind spinning. Then came the knock, heavy, slow, final. Elise didn't move. The knock came again, louder. Then a voice, the same one she heard on the phone, calm but unyielding. He said her name once more. She opened the door. He was standing there, the man she'd saved, alive, dressed in black, his face still bruised, but his presence overwhelming. The kind of presence that made the air itself obey. He didn't thank her. He didn't smile. He simply looked at her, studying every inch of her face like he was trying to read the part of her that didn't make sense to him. The part that risked everything for a stranger drowning in fire. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. He stepped closer, his cologne sharp and cold, his eyes softening for the briefest moment. He reached out, brushing his fingers against the cut on her arm, the one she got saving him. Then, in a voice quiet enough to send chills down her spine, he said she'd just changed her life forever. And in that instant, Elise knew the truth. She hadn't rescued a man. She'd pulled a storm out of the sea, and it was coming straight for her. Her pulse wouldn't slow down. The moment he said those words, something deep inside Elise snapped awake. The storm she'd pulled from the sea wasn't done with her. It had just found her address. He stepped past her without asking, every movement smooth and deliberate, as if he owned the air itself. His shoes barely made a sound on the floor, but the tension in the room screamed louder than any noise could. Elise stood frozen, her hands still clutching the doorknob, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. He turned, those dark eyes locking onto hers. They weren't eyes that questioned or wondered, they decided. The same way they must have decided who lived, who died, and who disappeared quietly. She opened her mouth to ask who he was, but he already knew what she was going to say. He told her not to, told her some things were better left unsaid. His voice was low, smooth, but every syllable carried authority that made her spine stiffen. Then he glanced at her arm again, the cut wrapped in a towel now, stained deep crimson, and told her she shouldn't let it get infected. He pulled out a small black case from his jacket, snapped it open, and revealed a bandage kit. She didn't even realize what was happening until he was right in front of her, cleaning the wound with steady hands. His touch wasn't gentle. It was precise, methodical, practiced. Like he'd done this before, many times, just never for someone outside his world. Elise watched his expression, trying to find the man she'd saved. The one who'd looked human and vulnerable as she dragged him from the wreck. But that man was gone. In his place stood something colder, sharper, built to survive. When he finished, he told her to rest, as if she could. She demanded to know what was going on, what the SUVs outside were for, why he'd shown up here. He looked at her with a faint smirk that wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. He said she'd saved him in front of people who weren't supposed to know he existed, that the crash wasn't an accident, and that whoever tried to kill him now knew there was a witness. Her stomach dropped. Witness. The word burned through her brain. He explained it like it was logistics, not drama, not danger, just fact. The jet had been sabotaged. The explosion meant to erase him. But she'd interfered, and now she was marked. Her name had been spoken in rooms that decided fates. And because of that, she couldn't go back to her normal life. Not yet. Elise's hands shook. She said she didn't want to be part of this. He laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was pointless. He told her she didn't get to choose. The moment she dragged him out of the water, her story rewrote itself. She wasn't just a rescuer anymore. She was leverage. He moved closer, his breath brushing her ear as he said that whoever ordered the hit wouldn't stop at him. They'd come for her too. because now she was the loose in a world that didn't tolerate loose ends. She wanted to scream at him to leave, to take his fleet of black vehicles and vanish. But fear rooted her to the ground. Suddenly, one of the men outside entered the apartment, whispering something into the man's ear. The look that crossed his face was lethal. He told Elise to pack a bag now. She asked why, but his tone cut her off before she could finish. They were leaving. Her body moved on instinct, throwing clothes into a small duffel, heart pounding so fast it hurt. She didn't even have time to grab her phone charger before he grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the door. Outside, the night air was thick with tension. Men stood by the SUVs, scanning every shadow. The moment she stepped outside, a hand guided her toward one of the cars. Everything moved like a coordinated dance, silent, fast, merciless. She slid into the back seat, and the door slammed shut beside her. The man she'd saved sat beside her, eyes on the road ahead as the convoy rolled out. The silence inside the car was unbearable. The hum of engines, the faint static on the radio, the rhythmic thud of her own heart. That was all she could hear. She wanted to ask who was chasing them, but the words wouldn't come out. Finally, she whispered his name, but realized she didn't even know it. He turned slightly, his profile lit by the flicker of passing streetlights. Then he said it, a single name that didn't sound like a name, it sounded like a warning. Dante. The name hit her like a punch. She'd heard it before. Everyone had. Not from people who knew him, but from the kind of stories no one dared confirm. Dante Russo, the man who owned half the city's silence. The one whispered about in corners. The one who made deals that shaped empires and buried rivals before breakfast. Elise's chest tightened. She dragged a devil out of the ocean. He caught the look in her eyes and told her not to believe everything she heard. That sometimes devils are just men forced to play roles others wrote for them. But she could feel the weight in his tone, the weariness of someone who'd seen too much to be innocent. The car suddenly swerved. The driver cursed, tires screeching. Elise gasped as the SUV jerked sideways. Gunfire cracked through the night. Bullets hit metal, sparks flashing past the windows. Dante grabbed her, yanked her down as the windshield exploded into shards. The vehicle behind them returned fire, the sound so loud it drowned out everything else. Elise could barely breathe. She tasted fear in her mouth, metallic and bitter. Dante barked an order. The driver accelerated, engines roaring like thunder. The convoy split, two cars taking a hard right, the rest blocking the road. Through the shattered window, Elise caught glimpses of masked men on motorcycles, their weapons flashing under the streetlights. Whoever was after them wasn't small time. This was organized, ruthless, personal. Dante pulled a gun from his jacket, checked the magazine, and opened his door mid-speed. Elise screamed as he leaned out, firing precise bursts that dropped one of the bikes. He slid back in, calm as if it were nothing. She stared at him, adrenaline shaking her bones. He looked back at her and said one thing, that this was her life now. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, the chaos faded. The convoy regrouped, and the car slowed. Dante's voice softened, but it carried that same authority that never left. He told her they couldn't go back to her apartment. It was compromised. Whoever hit them knew she existed, which meant they'd find her again if she stayed anywhere predictable. She wanted to argue, to tell him this wasn't fair, that she never asked for this. But all she could do was nod, tears burning her eyes. They drove for hours, city lights fading into endless roads. Eventually, the SUV stopped at a remote mansion perched above the sea. Armed guards opened the gates, and Elise felt the weight of a world she didn't belong in pressing down on her shoulders. Dante stepped out first, motioned for her to follow. Inside, the mansion was silent. No warmth, no welcome, just walls that hid too many secrets. He led her into a room lined with monitors showing live feeds from around the estate. She realized then this wasn't safety. It was surveillance. He told her she could stay here, that no one would touch her under his protection. But he also told her protection came with rules. She would not leave without permission. She would not contact anyone. She would not question what she saw or heard. She asked what would happen if she refused. He looked at her long enough for the silence to answer. As he walked away, she caught sight of his reflection in the glass. His jaw clenched, his shoulders tense. For the first time, he looked haunted, like saving him had forced him to confront something he'd buried long ago. When she was finally alone, she sank onto the couch, shaking uncontrollably. Outside, waves crashed against the rocks below, but she barely heard them. Her world had shifted violently, irreversibly. Somewhere deep inside that house, Dante made a call. His voice was calm but deadly. He told someone the girl stays alive, untouched, unseen, unharmed. And then, quieter, like it was meant only for himself, he said she reminded him of something he'd lost. Elise didn't know what that meant yet, but she could feel it in her bones. She wasn't just part of his story now. She was the only piece he couldn't control, and that made her dangerous. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time she tried to breathe, the sound of gunfire echoed again in her memory. The screaming, the water flooding the cabin, the way his hand had clamped around her wrist as if her life belonged to him now. The world had gone silent after that, but the silence wasn't peace. It was the sound of something watching her, something waiting. She hadn't slept in 24 hours, maybe more. Every car that passed her window made her jump. Every vibration from her phone twisted her stomach. She didn't know who he was, at least not until that morning. The news broke before sunrise. The man she had dragged from the sinking jet wasn't a politician, not a businessman, not a lost tourist. He was Matteo Ricci, the head of the Ricci crime family, the most feared mafia organization on the East Coast. And now he knew her name. When the doorbell rang, her knees almost gave out. She wasn't expecting anyone. The clock read 9:42 a.m. Her heart slammed into her ribs. For a second, she told herself it was nothing, a delivery, a mistake, anything but them. But then came the sound, tires grinding against asphalt, engines idling in unison. She peeked through the curtain. A line of black SUVs stretched down the street, windows tinted dark as death. The air outside was still, the kind of stillness that warned you something bad was about to happen. She froze when the knocking turned into pounding. Then a voice, deep, calm, dangerous, called her name. No shouting, no rage, just command, the kind that didn't ask permission. She tried to move, but her body refused. Her legs didn't feel real. For a moment, she thought about running out the back door, but as she turned, another SUV blocked the alleyway behind her house. They had her surrounded. The handle turned. Not kicked, not broken, turned. They'd unlocked her door somehow. Two men stepped inside, dressed in black, faces unreadable. She stepped back until her spine hit the wall. One of them gestured for her to stay calm. His movements were almost polite, but his eyes held no warmth. Then another figure appeared behind them. He didn't wear black. He wore a dark gray suit, perfectly tailored, his shirt crisp, his face marked with a healing bruise near his temple. The bruise she'd seen him get when the jet hit the water. Matteo Ricci, alive, breathing, in her house. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them vibrated with unspoken recognition. Her pulse raced, her lungs barely keeping up. He looked at her like she was something he couldn't quite explain, a ghost, a savior, or maybe a mistake. When he stepped forward, her instinct screamed to retreat, but her back was already against the wall. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten her. He simply said her name again, slower this time, as if tasting it. Then he thanked her for saving his life. But the words didn't sound like gratitude. They sounded like debt, heavy and binding. He told her she was now part of something she didn't understand. That when someone saves the life of a Ricci, that life becomes intertwined with his world, his people, his enemies. He said it wasn't a choice. That every rival family, every assassin, every cop who wanted him dead now knew her name, her address, her face, and that he wasn't there to threaten her. He was there to protect her. But she didn't believe him. The way his men moved around her kitchen, silent, efficient, scanning every corner. It wasn't protection. It was control. When she asked him why she couldn't just disappear, his expression didn't change. He told her if she disappeared, they'd assume she'd been taken by one of his enemies. and then they'd come looking for her, for everyone she knew. She felt the room closing in. Her body trembled as he stepped closer, his scent a mixture of smoke, metal, and expensive cologne. He told her she'd be moving to a safe house under his guard. No argument, no questions. His men began packing her things before she could protest. She tried to shout, tried to push them away, but her words vanished against the tension hanging in the air. Mateo didn't even raise his hand to stop her. He didn't need to. One glance from him, and the air shifted, pulling her willpower out from under her. Outside, neighbors peeked through blinds as men in suits loaded her luggage into SUVs. No one dared open their door. No one asked questions. When Mateo guided her out the front door, his hand resting lightly at her back, she could feel her heart pounding through her spine. Every instinct screamed that she was walking into a trap, but there was no other path. The ride was silent. The tinted windows turned daylight into shadow. Mateo sat beside her, unreadable, scrolling through his phone while she stared at her trembling hands. The city blurred by outside, but she couldn't focus. She asked him what he planned to do with her. He didn't answer immediately. He said he owed her a debt, one he couldn't repay with money or gratitude. That saving his life came with consequences she couldn't run from. That her presence had already changed things in his world. They stopped outside a high-rise tower, glass, steel, and security thicker than a government building. He led her through the entrance without looking back. Inside, men nodded respectfully as he passed. She followed, each step echoing louder than the last. They entered a penthouse so lavish it barely felt real, but she couldn't see it clearly through the fear clouding her mind. When he finally turned to face her, he asked a question that didn't sound like a question. He asked why she saved him. The answer came out broken, because it was the right thing to do. He studied her like he didn't understand the meaning of those words. Then, quietly, he told her the men on that jet were trying to kill him, that the crash wasn't an accident, that if she hadn't been there, his enemies would have succeeded. And now, because of her, everything had changed. She felt dizzy. His tone softened slightly, but it didn't comfort her. It made her chest tighten. He told her she had two choices: trust him or die outside his protection. No gray area, no in between. His world was made of absolutes. That night, she couldn't sleep. The city lights flickered against the windows, and every shadow looked like a gun barrel aimed at her. She heard Mateo's voice from the other room, low and firm, issuing orders into a phone. She couldn't make out the words, but she caught fragments: security detail, retaliation, perimeter breach. She realized this wasn't protection. This was a storm she'd been dragged into without warning. And somewhere deep down, beneath the fear, she felt something else, a pull. A strange, dangerous fascination with the man whose life she'd saved. The way his presence filled the room, the way he commanded silence, the way his eyes softened for only a heartbeat before turning cold again. It terrified her how much she noticed. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of the ocean swallowing her again. Only this time, when a hand reached out to save her, it wasn't hers pulling him up. It was his hand pulling her down. She woke to shouting. Mateo's men were in motion, moving fast, armed. He appeared at her door, tension burning in his expression. They'd been found. Someone had tracked them down. And for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't control or power. It was fear, not for himself, but for her. Chaos erupted before she could even move. Mateo barked orders sharp enough to slice the air, his men scattering like shadows, guns drawn, every muscle wired for war. The room pulsed with tension, her heartbeat syncing with the sound of boots hitting marble. She tried to stand, but his hand pressed against her shoulder, firm and final. Stay down. That single command ripped through her fear like a blade. The hallway lights dimmed, and the faint sound of an elevator grinding stopped halfway up the shaft. Someone had cut the power. Someone was already inside. The penthouse windows turned black against the city skyline. Her breath hitched as Mateo's men positioned themselves by the doors. Every second stretched thin, silence breaking only with the metallic click of safeties being released. Mateo crouched near her, eyes fixed, his expression unreadable yet burning with fury. This wasn't the calm, composed boss she'd met hours ago. This was the predator unleashed, stripped of charm and wrapped in vengeance. The first explosion came from the hallway. A flash of white smoke, the thunder of impact, glass shattering across the floor. Men shouted commands. Gunfire erupted in bursts so loud it shook the walls. She covered her head, but Mateo pulled her close, dragging her behind the overturned couch as bullets ripped through the furniture. The air filled with the smell of smoke, metal, and adrenaline. He whispered something too fast to catch, but she felt the intent. Move when I say. The smoke cleared enough for her to see silhouettes moving through the haze. They weren't his men. Tactical suits, helmets, silencers, professional killers. Her pulse went feral. Mateo's hand tightened around her wrist as he pulled her to her feet, moving low, fast, calculated. He pushed open a hidden door behind a bookshelf, revealing a narrow passage lined with steel. She stumbled inside, her vision swimming from fear and shock. Behind them, the penthouse detonated again, flames licking the ceiling, gunfire echoing like thunder in hell. They ran through a concrete tunnel, her bare feet slipping on the cold floor. Mateo didn't look back once. Every turn he took felt deliberate, like he'd memorized every inch of this escape route long before the attack. When they burst out into an underground garage, she gasped for air, chest on fire, eyes wide. SUVs lined the walls, but one black sports car waited in the center, engine already running. He pushed her inside and slammed the door. Within seconds, they were tearing through the exit ramp, tires screeching against wet pavement as sirens howled in the distance. Her voice finally broke free. She demanded to know what was happening, who was attacking them, why her life had turned into a nightmare overnight. Mateo didn't answer. His jaw was set tight, eyes burning holes through the road ahead. She shouted again, louder this time, but he snapped at her to stay quiet. Then his tone shifted, low and dangerous. Someone betrayed them. Someone inside his organization sold information, her location, his survival, everything. And whoever did it wanted her dead first. She turned cold all over. The realization hit like a punch. She hadn't just saved a man, she'd ignited a war. They swerved down a side street, the roar of engines closing in behind them. More SUVs, dark, fast, relentless. Mateo cursed under his breath and slammed the accelerator. The chase tore through the city, glass and metal blurring together as gunfire sparked from behind. She ducked, covering her head, the sound of bullets pinging off metal like hail. Mateo spun the wheel hard, sending the car into a sideways slide that barely missed a barrier. Her scream caught in her throat as he leaned into the turn, calm even as chaos clawed at them from all sides. They hit the freeway, and Mateo reached for the glove compartment, tossing her a small pistol. Her hand shook as she stared at it, but he snapped at her again, sharper now. If she wanted to live, she'd have to use it. She'd never even held a gun before, but something inside her cracked open. The fear turned to fuel. When the SUV behind them pulled close, she lifted the weapon, aimed with both hands, and fired. The recoil jolted her entire arm, the shot barely grazing the windshield. But Mateo smirked, just barely, like he saw something in her he hadn't expected. Moments later, another explosion. Mateo slammed the brakes, swerving behind a concrete divider as flames erupted from the SUV chasing them. One of his men must have hit it from a distance. Reinforcements, she realized. The city screamed with sirens as they disappeared down an unmarked road. Her body trembled, heart thrumming like thunder. She wanted to cry, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare. But something about Mateo's expression stopped her. When it finally stopped, it was outside a decaying warehouse near the docks. His men surrounded them instantly, checking corners, clearing the perimeter. Mateo got out, adjusted his jacket as if they hadn't just escaped an ambush, and walked toward the building without looking back. She followed, barely able to keep her balance. Inside, a small team waited, grim faces, tense postures. A map covered one wall, red markings scattered across it like blood splatters. Mateo pointed to one name circled in ink. His voice was sharp enough to cut the silence. That was the traitor. She caught fragments, family, betrayal, inside leak, payment. Then he turned to her and said something that froze her blood. They didn't just come for him. They came for her. Because she'd saved him, she'd changed the power balance. His enemies saw her as leverage, a tool to break him. She wasn't just caught in his war now. She was the war. She tried to deny it, shaking her head, telling him she was just a waitress, a nobody. But Mateo's hand slammed onto the table, the sound cracking like lightning. He told her there were no nobodies anymore, not when blood was involved. His words burned through her, hot and terrifying. Then he softened, just slightly. He told her he hadn't asked for this, hadn't planned it, but fate had forced her into his path. That whether she liked it or not, her name was now linked to his. And that meant his enemies wouldn't stop until one of them was gone. The room fell silent again. The only sound was her shaky breathing and the faint hum of the city outside. Then Mateo turned away, staring at the wall like he was speaking to ghosts. He said he'd lost too much to let this happen again, that the next time they came for her, they'd find him waiting. She didn't know whether to be terrified or grateful. The air between them felt alive, like static before lightning. He turned back, his gaze locking with hers. For the first time since the crash, she saw something human behind those eyes. Pain, exhaustion, maybe even guilt. It flickered for a second, then vanished, replaced by the cold steel of the boss again. He told her to rest, that they'd leave before dawn. But when she closed her eyes, the image burned behind her eyelids, the wrecked jet sinking into the sea, his hand clutching hers in the darkness. And now, this same man dragging her deeper into a life where every heartbeat was borrowed time. Outside, a phone buzzed on the table. One of Mateo's men answered, pale as he listened. When he hung up, the words came out quiet but heavy. They found the traitor, but he wasn't alone. Someone bigger had ordered the hit. Someone Mateo didn't expect. Mateo's jaw clenched, and a muscle twitched in his temple. He looked toward her again, his voice low and tight. This wasn't over, not even close. When she opened her eyes, sunlight was spilling through the blinds, blinding her for a moment. For a heartbeat, she thought it had all been a dream. The explosion, the gunfire, Mateo bleeding in her arms. But then the low hum of engines outside reminded her. The SUVs were still there, black, gleaming, lined up like sentinels in front of her small home. She pulled the blanket around her and walked to the window. Every man out there was watching the street, silent and still, waiting for orders that would never come. Mateo's orders. Her hands trembled as she opened the door and stepped out, the morning air cutting cold against her skin. The moment the guards saw her, they straightened, heads bowing in respect, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. One of them stepped forward, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, and handed her an envelope sealed in black wax with the same insignia she'd seen etched on Mateo's ring. She tore it open with shaking fingers, her breath catching as she read the first line. It was Mateo's handwriting, firm, controlled, and somehow gentle. He thanked her for saving his life twice, said that she'd done what none of his men could do, remind him what loyalty meant. He wrote that he'd stepped down, handed over everything to be dismantled piece by piece. No more blood, no more empire. He'd chosen to disappear, to heal in silence somewhere far away. And then, as if he knew she'd be crying while reading, he added a single line that broke her completely. You pulled me out of the fire. Now live your life without fear of it. At the bottom was a signature and a key, not to a weapon, not to a safe, to a foundation. He'd set up something in her name, the Phoenix Trust, for rebuilding homes, helping victims of crime, women who had been trapped in violence. It was his way of making things right, of turning the ashes into something that could still burn, but with purpose. She pressed the letter to her chest and sank onto the steps, the weight of everything hitting her at once. The guilt, the pain, the loss, and underneath it all, gratitude. Mateo wasn't gone forever. He was simply giving her a chance to live in a world he'd spent his life destroying. A car door opened behind her, and one of his oldest men walked up, holding something small wrapped in cloth. He said Mateo wanted her to have it. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing his ring, the same one he'd worn the night she dragged him out of the wreckage. Inside the band, engraved so faintly it could almost be missed, were three words: "You saved me." She slipped it into her palm, closed her hand around it, and felt something in her chest finally loosen. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't the scared woman who kept her head down and her heart locked away. Mateo had given her more than his protection. He'd given her back her power. Over the next few days, the men stayed, quietly watching over her, as if fulfilling the last unspoken order. The city was calmer than it had been in years. Whispers spread fast. The empire had fallen, the bloodlines had scattered, and the man who once ruled through fear had vanished without a trace. No one dared to touch her, not because of who she worked for, but because of what she had done. The woman who had dragged a mafia boss out of a burning jet and walked away with her head held high. Weeks passed before she received another sign of him. A single postcard arrived in her mailbox. No return address, just a photograph of an empty coastline, waves breaking under a golden sunset. On the back, in that same careful handwriting, were the words, "I still owe you a dinner." No name, no signature, just enough to let her know he was alive. She smiled through tears, clutching the postcard to her chest. Somewhere out there, the man everyone feared was finding his redemption, and she was finding her peace. The noise, the violence, the chaos, all gone. All that was left was the echo of two lives forever changed by a single act of courage. She turned the ring over in her hand one last time before slipping it into a chain around her neck. It rested just over her heart, where it would stay, not as a symbol of what he was, but of who he became because of her. That night, as the city lights blinked below the horizon, she finally slept without fear. The nightmares were gone. The sound of fire no longer haunted her, because she knew, somewhere beyond the reach of her world, Mateo was keeping his promise to live differently, to make things right, to never forget the woman who saw a man worth saving beneath the monster the world had made him. Sometimes the people we fear most are the ones searching hardest for redemption. A single act of courage can turn even the darkest story toward light. She risked her life for him, and he gave her a new. Share this story and stay tuned for the next one.